They didn't negotiate, they grabbed it. The U.S. executive branch said, "We will take it," referring to Venezuelan oil exports. The president added he didn't have to consult with anybody, not Congress, not the courts, not even the Attorney General. The value cited on the first day alone was $5.2 billion. Now watch the contradiction. This is being sold like a foreign policy story, but it's also a domestic system story that reaches your wallet. Refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf Coast were built decades ago and tuned for Venezuelan heavy crude. Without that feedstock, refiners are described as very anxious to reintegrate it because efficiency drops. In other words, the U.S. isn't just pressuring Venezuela, it's correcting a technical dependency inside its own energy machine. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. The Department of Energy confirmed the U.S. will take the majority of Venezuelan exports, controlling the sale and movement of the oil. That control doesn't just change Venezuela's future. It gives the U.S. a new lever over prices, construction costs, and global supply shocks. And the next step is where this turns from headline into a blueprint. Good. Here's the next part. What just happened didn't start with a single announcement. It's part of a pattern that's been forming quietly. The U.S. is moving to take the majority of Venezuelan oil exports, but not all of them. Some barrels will still be sold to Europe and Asia on the global market. The difference is who controls the valve. The sales, the routing, the custody of the oil itself all sit under U.S. oversight. This matters because it reframes the event. This isn't about punishing a regime. It's about repositioning a resource. The stated goal is for the proceeds to help Venezuela get back on its feet while the U.S. manages the flow and movement of the commodity. That structure removes financial autonomy from the current power center without formally changing leadership. Now notice what's missing. There's no long negotiation timeline, no drawn-out multilateral process, no extended congressional debate. The executive branch acted first and explained later. Here's the reframing question. If a country controls the extraction, the transport, and the sale of another nation's primary resource, who actually holds the power? Because once you see this as infrastructure control instead of diplomacy, the next phase becomes predictable. Here's where the claim sharpens. The U.S. didn't step in as a partner. It stepped in as a broker. The Department of Energy confirmed the U.S. will take the majority of Venezuelan exports. While some oil will be sold to Europe and Asia, the bulk is earmarked for the U.S. market. The revenue is technically designated to go to Venezuela to help the country get back on its feet, but the sale, routing, and physical movement of the oil are controlled by the United States. That detail matters more than it sounds. Control isn't about ownership on paper. It's about who decides when the oil moves, where it goes, and at what pace. By managing the flow, the U.S. effectively dollarizes Venezuelan oil under American supervision without formally annexing anything. Now notice what they didn't deny. There was no claim that Venezuela would independently market its own exports. No statement about restoring full financial autonomy first. The system was designed with custodial language from the start. Here's why that changes everything. Oil isn't just revenue. It's leverage. Whoever controls the timing of supply controls price pressure, market shocks, and political breathing room. And once that lever is pulled, the effects don't stay overseas for long. This is where the situation accelerates. Once the U.S. positioned itself as the broker, the logic stopped being diplomatic and became mechanical. American refineries along the Gulf Coast were built decades ago to process heavy crude like Venezuela's. Without that specific grade, efficiency drops, costs rise, and refiners become, in their own words, very anxious to restore supply. This isn't new behavior. Historically, when industrial systems are built around a single input, access to that input becomes non-negotiable. What's different now is how openly that reality is being enforced. There's no pretense of multilateral consensus, no slow normalization. The control is immediate. But here's where the story flips. Venezuelan heavy crude isn't just fuel. It's a primary input for asphalt. The Department of Energy directly links this oil to driving down the price of asphalt and triggering a new construction boom in the United States. That's the normalization. A foreign seizure quietly reframed as domestic cost control, roads, infrastructure, inflation metrics. What used to be extraordinary power projection is now treated as standard economic management. And that normalization sets up a much more unsettling contradiction in the next phase. Now watch how the evidence gets sharper and more revealing. The Department of Energy connects Venezuelan heavy crude to a direct domestic goal: drive down the price of asphalt. It's not just asphalt. The same import flow is tied to gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel inputs. The stated outcome is a new construction boom and enormous economic benefits to the American taxpayer through reduced material costs. Here's the contradiction that changes how you see it. The public framing sounds like Venezuela is being helped to get back on its feet. That phrase is explicitly used, but the operational design puts physical control of the commodity movement and sale in American hands. That means Venezuela's main resource becomes a tool to manage U.S. inflation and infrastructure costs first, while reconstruction funding becomes the secondary justification. Notice what they didn't emphasize. They didn't lead with Venezuelan sovereignty. They led with American price relief, asphalt, construction, cost curves. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. If your domestic inflation plan depends on controlling someone else's oil flow, then any disruption becomes a political emergency. And the global market context is exactly where this starts to look like a control operation, not a trade deal. This is where the pressure starts stacking. Global oil markets are already volatile. There is unprecedented unrest in Iran with real risk of supply disruption. Venezuela is described as a sleeping giant, once producing nearly 3.5 million barrels a day before collapsing to under a million. Now stack the implications. If Venezuelan production comes back too fast, it can flood the market and crash prices. If it comes back too slowly, it can't offset Middle East instability. That's why the U.S. strategy centers on taking the majority of exports and managing the flow. This isn't about maximizing output, it's about pacing. Control becomes the shock absorber. But here's where the system starts to feel unstable. One country is now managing supply pressure from Iran, price volatility in global markets, domestic inflation targets, and foreign reconstruction funding, all through a single resource stream. Notice how fast this escalates. One disruption, one miscalculation, and the balancing act breaks. So the real question isn't whether this works today. It's what happens if this continues. Now we bring it down to the human level, because this is where people feel it first. You don't experience energy strategy as a headline. You experience it when the price of daily life shifts. The plan explicitly ties Venezuelan heavy crude to driving down asphalt costs. That means road projects, repairs, and infrastructure budgets live or die on input prices. If asphalt drops, construction accelerates. If it spikes, projects stall, costs balloon, and taxpayers absorb it through delays and overruns. You feel it in fuel too. The same supply is connected to gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel inputs. That doesn't guarantee cheaper prices, but it does mean a new lever exists, one designed to dampen inflation pressure at home. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. If your cost of roads and the cost of energy start depending on controlled foreign supply, then everyday stability becomes a policy decision made far from you and moved at executive speed. And when policies move that fast, the errors hit regular people first. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because the mechanism behind this, how systems turn resources into control, is even bigger than Venezuela. This is where you have to zoom out, because outrage doesn't explain this. Systems do. What allows something like this to happen isn't secrecy. It's incentive alignment. The U.S. gains inflation relief, cheaper infrastructure inputs, and refinery efficiency. Tech companies are driving massive new energy demand. The administration is simultaneously pushing mechanisms like forcing big tech to underwrite new power generation through an electricity auction. This is leverage stacking. Energy control abroad stabilizes prices at home, while capital-intensive demand is shifted onto corporate balance sheets instead of households. Here's the unsettling insight. When systems are under pressure, legality becomes flexible and speed becomes the primary virtue. The same executive acceleration is visible in oil seizures and in compressing timelines for new nuclear reactors. Debate slows markets, action moves them. Notice what this system rewards: not caution, not consensus, velocity. And once velocity becomes the governing principle, decisions stop being reversible. They create facts on the ground, oil flowing, reactors operating, markets adapting. That's why this story isn't about Venezuela alone. It's about how modern power operates when time becomes the scarcest resource. And that brings us directly to what happens next. Now we're at the fork in the road, and neither path is stable. One direction looks controlled, at least on the surface. If Venezuelan production ramps up under U.S. management, it can offset unrest in Iran, smooth global supply, and keep domestic input prices in check. That path buys time. It lowers volatility, reassures markets, and locks in the idea that this system works. But there's a second path forming at the same time. Venezuela's reserves are enormous, larger than Saudi Arabia's. Western firms are eager to return, but only if the rule of law premium is restored. The moment legal guarantees wobble or leadership alignment fractures, capital freezes instantly, and the entire flow model seizes up. Here's where the uncertainty compounds. The faster this system moves, the less margin it has for political error. One leadership shift, one legal reversal, one external shock. Notice the momentum. No one is talking about reversing course. The infrastructure, the contracts, the expectations are already forming, which means the next move isn't a debate, it's an event. And the closing question becomes unavoidable. Who benefits most if this locks in, and who pays if it doesn't? Here's the part that ties everything together and quietly opens the next loop. This entire story can be reduced to one idea. Control of energy is no longer about barrels. It's about timing, custody, and flow. The U.S. is integrating Venezuelan oil, U.S. refining capacity, tech-driven power demand, and accelerated nuclear deployment into a single system. The goal is lower inflation, cheaper infrastructure, grid stability, and reduced migration pressure. When those incentives align, traditional diplomacy becomes optional. Here's the reframe. This wasn't a foreign policy gamble. It was a systems consolidation. Roads, power, migration, and markets were folded into one lever. And that's the part most coverage misses. Once a system like this starts working, it doesn't roll back quietly. It expands, it looks for the next constraint to absorb. If you want to understand where energy, infrastructure, and power are heading next, this isn't the end of the story. It's the template. Follow for the next layer, because the next move is already forming, and it won't be announced in advance.